Okay, so our next task is installing the tail servo and the tail servo push rod, which goes from the tail servo back to our tail pitch slider to control the pitch on our tail rotor. So I'm using a Futaba 9257 as my tail rotor. This is a nice fast servo and it should provide the kind of power and speed that I need for a good tail. Okay, so to do the first part of this install, we're using two servo mounting screws and this small plastic part, which is basically for the screws to screw into behind the carbon fibre bracket that we've already bolted onto our side frames. So I'm going to go ahead and install the first two screws and this part onto the model, and I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, so here we have the rear of our model. This is our carbon fibre bracket that we mounted earlier on, and I've just screwed one side of the servo here through the carbon fibre bracket, and then on the other side here, if I turn this over, there is the little plastic piece that I showed you, which the screws are screwed into. And these screws are actually the standard servo mounting screws. They're quite long. I may look for some replacements which are a little bit shorter than that to do that job, because they stick out a bit. That's the idea anyhow. So the next job is for us to bolt on this side, so the servo goes onto this bracket here, which I'm just sort of lining up. See, that goes on there, and then the servo screws go through and into that plastic bracket at the back and just self-tap into it. So it's important at this stage not to tighten these screws up too much, because you'll strip the threads in here. So you just want to tighten it up enough that the servo is held. Okay, so there we have our second two servo screws installed. See that? I found some ones that are a little bit shorter for these ones this side. It's just screwed on like so. And at this point we can put the self-tapping screw in here, which will hold this bracket tight onto the boom. And I have that here. Okay, here it is. This is the one. It's just this little silver self-tapping screw, and that goes in that bracket. Okay, and there we go. There's the screw installed, and this bracket is now solid on the boom. This can't move at all. Now, if you need to adjust the servo, what you'll notice is that this carbon fibre here actually has some slots in it, so you can loosen off this screw here and then slide this bracket on those slots. So if you do need to adjust your belt tension, you can adjust the tail push rod afterwards without having to do too much work moving this around on the boom. So at this point we can tighten up these two screws and make sure they're Loctited to hold that in position, and get on with making up a tail push rod, and then we may have to alter these in order to get our tail right when we set up the gyro. Okay, our next job is installing the balls onto the servo horn, and also installing a ball onto our tail control bell crank at the back of the machine underneath the tail gearbox. For that we've got a screw, the ball and a nut for our servo horn, and then just a screw and ball for our bell crank at the back of the machine, and we hold this one in place with some thick CA, which is not as easy to say as I would like. This one we just put the nut on the other side and we Loctite it, although we don't do that up tight just yet. Okay, so that's our ball installed on the servo horn with a nut underneath and the ball on the top. And the distance for this ball from the centre point of the servo is 8mm. Okay, and here we have the underside of our tail gearbox, and this is the ball that I've installed onto the bell crank there. As I say, thick CA on this when you screw it in, so that won't come out again. Okay, so our next job is making up our tail push rod. This is made from a single piece of carbon rod, which I've got here. We rough up the ends of this with sandpaper and then put these end caps on it. And this one effectively goes on that end like that, like so. And then we have these threaded rods which thread into the end, and then the ball link threads onto the other end of that threaded rod. And we have to make sure that we glue these on with thick CA. So we rough up this end of the carbon rod to make something for the CA to purchase onto, and then insert it in, and it should glue on there and stay on. And for roughing up the end, you just use some fine grit sandpaper. Okay, so there we have a completed tail push rod end. The plastic part has been CA'd onto the carbon rod, and then the threaded rod here has been installed into the plastic end until it won't thread in any further. And then the same has been done here on the other side. And this isn't quite dry yet, you can see it's still a little bit shiny where I've glued it. Next thing to do is to install the ball links onto the end here, and then leave 2mm of the threaded rod showing once the ball link has been screwed on. Okay, like so, and that should leave you something that looks something much like this, and the same on the other side. And that's the tail push rod completed. We can now move on to the tail boom supports and the horizontal fin. Our boom supports are assembled in a very similar way. Again, we have a carbon rod. We need to sand one end and then sand the other end, and then fit these end caps on and again glue them into place. Now, one thing we need to be careful of is when these end caps are on, they need to be orientated so that they are parallel to one another. So effectively, if you've got one on one end like so, and you can see the hole there, when you go to the other end, the one on the other end should be aligned in exactly the same way. So you can see the hole like so, so they're perfectly in alignment. Because this is going to bolt to the machine, and you need both of these end caps to be aligned, and there are some tips in the manual as to how you do that. Okay, so there's our end glued onto our boom support, and one on the other end. As you can see, the hole here is aligned, and if I bring it through, you can see the hole the other end also in line. So we can now take these and our horizontal fin, which I'll show you in a moment, and we can bolt all of this using the screws supplied onto the back of the machine. Okay, so here we have the bits in order to achieve what I just described. This is our horizontal fin, and also take note that there is a longer screw which goes on the left hand side of the fin and a shorter screw which goes on the right hand side, and this is because one of these screws goes right down into the bracket on the boom and causes it to clamp onto the boom, and the other screw just holds the fin onto the bracket. And then we have 4 screws the same with washers which go through the ends of our push rods and bolt into the bracket on the boom and the back of our frames. So I'll install all of that, and then you can see what it looks like. Okay, so once installed, you have your bolt in the back here with the washer. This one is going into metal, so this has Loctite on it, as does the one on the other side, and then this travels up the boom to the horizontal fin clamp, and here we've got thick CA on this screw and washer into the plastic horizontal fin mount, and the same the other side. And then for the fin mount itself, the short screw is the side of the fin mount that doesn't have a split in it, and the long screw is on the side that has a split on it and performs the clamping action on the boom. So the long bolt goes into the side with the split, And then you tighten that up and just make sure that your fin is horizontal once it's all tightened up.